The courtroom was buzzing with quiet anticipation, the kind that settles before a storm. Reporters lined the rear benches, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of drama. Legal aides shuffled papers with deliberate calm, yet their glances betrayed the anxiety in the air. Every person present could feel it, something major was about to happen. The double doors opened slowly, and Jasmine Crockett stepped through with deliberate steps. Her presence was commanding, her expression unreadable. The sound of her heels echoed as she made her way down the aisle, past rows of attorneys and lawmakers who sat up a little straighter in her wake. She carried no notes, no visible legal pads, just the steel in her eyes and the quiet confidence of someone who had come prepared for battle. Across the courtroom, Chief Justice John Roberts sat poised behind the elevated bench. His gaze flicked toward her with restrained curiosity, but his fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the wooden desk, betraying a flicker of nerves. Crockett didn't break eye contact as she reached her place, offering a single nod of acknowledgement, one that didn't show respect, but rather recognition. The kind of look exchanged between two chess players just before the first move. An eerie hush fell over the courtroom. Even the usually chatty court reporters had stopped whispering. It felt less like the beginning of a trial and more like a political powder keg seconds from ignition. The court clerk called the session to order, but no one's eyes left the two key players. Crockett placed her hands calmly on the desk in front of her, her posture straight, her jaw slightly clenched. She wasn't just ready to speak, she was ready to confront. A young aide from the justice's chambers leaned in to whisper something to Roberts, but he waved it off without listening, his full attention now fixed on the congresswoman. He straightened his robes, cleared his throat, and opened the day's session with practiced formality. But even his voice, steady and controlled, couldn't hide the subtle strain. The energy between them pulsed in the silence that followed. The nation hadn't tuned in for just another legal proceeding, they had come to witness a collision of power and principle. And everyone in the room knew it had just begun. Chief Justice Roberts began speaking with the calm authority he was known for, his voice steady and deliberate as he laid out the expectations for decorum and procedure. He referenced previous rulings and outlined the framework under which the day's proceedings would unfold. Everything about his tone suggested control, order, and institutional command. For a few moments, it felt like a routine hearing, the kind that wouldn't leave a lasting impression. But Jasmine Crockett was not interested in routine. She leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on the Chief Justice, and then, with a calm but cutting tone, she interrupted him mid-sentence. "Mr. Chief Justice, with all due respect, I believe what you've just said is a mischaracterization of precedent." The words sliced through the room like a blade. The courtroom went still. Even the rustling of papers stopped. Crockett didn't raise her voice, but the impact of her interruption was immediate and seismic. Roberts paused, visibly surprised. Interruptions were rare, especially at this level. He blinked, then adjusted his position, trying to reassert his authority without appearing shaken. "I would advise the Congresswoman," Roberts replied slowly, "to observe the procedural norms of this court." "And I would advise this court," Crockett shot back, her voice rising just a notch, "to stop hiding behind norms when accountability is at stake." Her tone was sharp, but controlled, like a prosecutor who already knew the answer to the question she was about to ask. Murmurs swept across the gallery. A few aides shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging alarmed glances. Roberts leaned forward now, narrowing his eyes. "This institution will not be turned into a platform for political theater," he warned, the sternness returning to his voice. Crockett didn't flinch. "Then perhaps this institution should stop behaving like it's immune to scrutiny," she replied, placing her hand deliberately on the desk. "Because selective enforcement of justice is not law, it's manipulation." The tension between them now had shape, almost weight. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was ideological warfare. Roberts was trying to contain the courtroom in tradition and decorum, but Crockett was determined to expose what she saw as hypocrisy beneath the surface. She began quoting from a past decision, one where the court had ruled differently under similar circumstances. Her argument was pointed and detailed, not just a speech but a challenge built on legal grounding. Roberts opened his mouth to counter, but paused. She had preempted his rebuttal. He glanced briefly at one of the other justices, who avoided eye contact. Crockett had taken control, not by yelling or grandstanding, but by cornering the system with its own language. The law was her weapon, and she wielded it with precision. The courtroom was now utterly silent, every person on edge, waiting to see who would speak next. It was no longer about the formal rules. The balance of power had shifted, however slightly, and Jasmine Crockett had just lit the fuse. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's bold assertion was thick with tension, the kind that makes even the most seasoned observers hold their breath. Chief Justice Roberts adjusted his robe, leaned slightly forward, and spoke with a measured, deliberate tone that attempted to re-establish control. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, emphasizing each syllable with judicial restraint, "this court does not respond to theatrical accusations. We deliberate facts, not political provocations." His words were clear, his delivery tight, but his eyes gave him away. They held a flicker of frustration, perhaps even uncertainty, the kind rarely seen on the bench. Crockett didn't wait for an invitation to reply. She stood slowly, calmly, without a hint of panic or emotion. Her voice was firm and unwavering. "With all due respect, Chief Justice, this isn't theater. It's history, and I will not stand silent while the highest court in the land pretends it is above question." Her words echoed, drawing stunned looks from those in the chamber. She turned her body slightly, as if addressing not just the bench, but the American people watching outside those walls. Roberts's knuckles tightened slightly against the wooden bench. "You are walking a fine line, Congresswoman," he warned, his tone sharpening. The threat wasn't veiled, it was open. His voice, though not loud, carried the weight of decades of judicial power. "I'm well aware," Crockett replied. "I've been walking fine lines my whole career, lines this very court helped draw." The gallery erupted in a low gasp, some unable to hide their astonishment. Crockett was no longer simply debating legal points, she was exposing fault lines in the system, and she was doing it directly, without euphemism or apology. Roberts tried to bring the court back to order with a sharp gavel strike, but the usual authority behind that sound felt brittle, even desperate. Another justice leaned over to whisper something to Roberts, perhaps suggesting he de-escalate, but Roberts ignored it. His pride wouldn't allow it. "You will conduct yourself with the dignity befitting this chamber," he snapped, foregoing his usual calm. But Crockett had struck a nerve, and the control he was trying to maintain was slipping. Crockett walked 2 slow steps toward the center of the floor. "Dignity," she said, voice lower now, but powerful. Where was that dignity when this court reversed decades of precedent without a transparent rationale? Where was that dignity when corporate influence shaped outcomes that impact millions? If dignity means silence, then count me out. Roberts's face tightened. "This is a court of law, not a congressional hearing. You are out of order. And yet I'm still here," she fired back. "And you're still not answering the questions the American people are asking." The verbal exchange had become a full-blown standoff. Crockett, standing firmly in defiance, and Roberts, seated high yet increasingly on the defensive. The courtroom, packed with journalists, legal scholars, and onlookers, remained frozen, aware that they were watching something that would be dissected in law schools and newsrooms for years to come. Crockett wasn't just challenging Roberts. She was challenging the very sanctity of unchecked judicial power. Another gavel strike rang out, this time louder, almost panicked. But it didn't matter. The clash wasn't about volume. It was about truth. And Crockett, with each word, was forcing the court to confront its reflection. Chief Justice Roberts attempted to steer the hearing back to its formal agenda, lifting a file from the bench and reading from a prepared statement. His voice was even, but his hands betrayed a faint tremble as they gripped the document. He emphasized the impartiality of the judiciary, the solemn duty of the court to interpret law without influence or bias. But his words now sounded hollow, overshadowed by the storm that had just broken out. He glanced around the chamber, hoping to re-establish control, yet the room remained locked on Jasmine Crockett, who hadn't moved a muscle since her last statement. Her eyes were steady, calculating, like someone preparing her final move in a match that had already been won. Then, with measured calm, she reached into a slim leather folder on her table and withdrew a sealed document. The sound of the seal being torn open was oddly loud in the quiet room. She walked toward the front with confidence, her footsteps measured and firm, and placed the document on the clerk's table. "This," she said clearly, "is newly obtained evidence from a federal oversight committee. It contains communications that directly contradict the neutrality claimed by this bench." Her voice didn't rise, but its impact was thunderous. Roberts hesitated, his lips parted slightly, but no words came at first. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Crockett continued, "I was prepared for denial, so I brought receipts. Perhaps this court would like to review its own associations before questioning mine." She stepped back, folding her arms as the document was passed forward to the justices. One associate justice looked visibly stunned. Another leaned back, adjusting his glasses with a trembling hand. Roberts's face stiffened. He opened the file and scanned the contents quickly, his brow furrowing as he read. The color in his cheeks drained slightly, though he tried to maintain composure. He looked to his left and right, hoping to find an ally among his. Crockett had landed a blow that reached deep into the foundation of the court's supposed impartiality. The silence was unbearable. It hung in the air, dense and suffocating. Finally, Roberts spoke again, but the authority in his voice had thinned. "This court will recess for a brief review of the submitted material," he announced, his words mechanical. It was an attempt to stall, to regroup, to reframe the narrative. But it was already too late. Crockett didn't flinch, she didn't smile, didn't nod. She simply stood there, her hands behind her back, a living monument to what resolve looks like under pressure. She had flipped the power dynamic in a room that was designed to suppress dissent. And she had done it not through spectacle, but with facts and timing and bold defiance. As clerks and aides rushed to examine the material, the courtroom devolved into quiet chaos. The reporters were scribbling furiously. Some even stepped outside to place urgent calls. The drama had become more than political, it was constitutional. It was no longer about one woman challenging the system, it was about what happens when the system is forced to look in the mirror and can't deny what it sees. Justice Roberts placed the file down and leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. He knew what had just happened. For the first time in his long tenure on the bench, he had been outmaneuvered, not by a fellow judge, not by a senior lawyer, but by a bold legislator who refused to bow. He tapped his pen twice on the desk, more a nervous habit now than a signal. The court would reconvene shortly, but the damage was done. The illusion of invincibility had cracked. And everyone saw it. The tension in the courtroom had reached an unbearable peak. Even as the clerks busied themselves with the newly submitted evidence and the justices conferred in hushed tones, it was clear to everyone that the tone of the session had irreversibly changed. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless, her presence towering even without a podium or a robe. She wasn't just participating in the hearing anymore, she was directing its course. All eyes remained fixed on her, not because of what she might say next, but because of what she had already exposed. The very pillars of judicial decorum had been rattled, and the shockwaves hadn't finished spreading. Chief Justice Roberts closed the file in front of him, his hand lingering for a moment longer than necessary. He tried to regain a composed posture, but the slight downturn of his mouth betrayed a deeper awareness, he was no longer in command. He raised his gavel slowly, a symbol of his authority, but when he struck it against the bench, the sound rang hollow, like a tradition that had lost its meaning. "This court is now in recess until further notice," he announced stiffly, voice dry and clipped. At that moment, Crockett shifted. She didn't wait for the formality of adjournment. She gathered her folder, slid it back under her arm, and turned to face the gallery. Her gaze swept the room one last time. There was no victory smirk, no dramatic bow, just calm, piercing certainty. Her eyes briefly met those of a law clerk seated near the back. He looked away quickly, as if unable to hold her gaze. Without a word, she stepped away from the center floor, the click of her heels again echoing with eerie precision. Every step she took toward the courtroom doors felt deliberate, charged with the weight of what had just occurred. Reporters leaned into the aisle, cameras followed her with jittery hands, and security officers shifted uneasily, unsure whether to intervene or salute. No one stopped her. No one could. She passed the bench, then the first row of legal observers, then the final guard post near the exit. The great double doors that had swung open with formality earlier now loomed large behind her, as if acknowledging that something unprecedented had happened inside those walls. Just as she reached them, Crockett paused, only for a moment, and glanced back. Chief Justice Roberts had not moved. He sat rigid, face unreadable, as though frozen between anger and resignation. The other justices were still murmuring to one another, but no one dared speak up. The room was paralyzed, left in the vacuum she had created by refusing to play by the rules that were never designed to be fair to begin with. Crockett pushed the doors open with a quiet strength, and the light from the hallway spilled into the chamber. It was a moment of cinematic gravity, but there was no performance in her steps, only conviction. She didn't glance at the cameras that had now swarmed the corridor. She didn't wave, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the dozens of microphones being extended toward her. Outside the courtroom, her team stood waiting, stunned but alert. They had never seen her like this. She walked past them without breaking stride, making her way toward the elevators. Behind her, the massive doors creaked shut, the sound echoing like a period at the end of a sentence no one dared revise. Inside, Roberts finally moved. He removed his glasses, rubbed his temples, and muttered something inaudible to the clerk. The gavel lay untouched beside him now. The courtroom, once a temple of unchallenged authority, now felt like the scene of a reckoning. Crockett hadn't just walked out, she had left a mark. Not just on the docket or the news cycle, but on the legacy of the court itself. And no one present would ever forget the moment power shifted in silence.